American healthcare reform, arguably one of the most pressing arguments in recent political history. Currently, there are roughly 30 million Americans without health insurance.
Nobody dies because they don't have access to health care.
Nearly 45,000 deaths a year are associated with a lack of health coverage. Healthcare is a broken system that is becoming more and more of a capitalistic industry every year. This is a bipartisan agreement for change. The argument is the ways to approach the renewal and reform of the healthcare system. We are here to tackle the issue by discussing its history, possible solutions, human rights aspect, and how we can look towards a future of healthcare in America. American healthcare reform, arguably one of the most pressing arguments. The issue of healthcare has always been a pressing issue throughout American history. Medicine hadn't been a huge concern for the daily American in the 18th century. Most people just died of today preventable diseases. The healthcare industry only boomed in the mid-1800s after the discovery of antibiotics, proper amputations, proper contaminant control, and the invention of the hospital and private healthcare system, which stemmed from local drug dispensaries. The issue of healthcare has always been a pressing issue.
But the issue really inflamed with the advent of the changing economic climate during the infamous Great Depression, with a wide number of Americans not being able to afford access to healthcare. President Franklin D. Roosevelt favored creating national health insurance but decided to push for Social Security first. He never got the health program passed. After World War II, Harry S. Truman would be the first U.S. president to pursue healthcare after the war, opening a new era for democratic policy and the modernistic reform of the healthcare system. Unfortunately, Truman's idea would never make it past Congress, leaving Eisenhower's administration to be the first to enact a form of healthcare by enforcing military Medicare, which aided military dependents and those wounded from battle. The idea of public health care would be first enforced by Kennedy, yet his assassination would put an end to his globalist and domestic policies, and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson would take over and start the Great Society. Johnson would continue to fight the war against poverty and de jure and de facto segregation. Johnson would also be the first president to successfully establish health care after World War II by creating Medicare and Medicaid, which would cover persons over 65, the poor, the disabled, and the blind. But the issue really inflamed with the advent of the changing economic climate. During the war on drugs in the 80s, Reagan would expand the benefits of Medicare, which would expand coverage on outpatient drugs, put a ceiling on out-of-pocket copays for any medical visit, and expanded payments for long-term care. After Reagan's administration, millions of Americans would be covered with health insurance, and only small minor changes would be made for later administrations. The Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, was put into effect in 2010 after a huge congressional debate making health care theoretically available to all Americans while becoming more affordable for the lower class. The controversial aspect of the ACA is that because it is making healthcare free/affordable for the lower class, it is also taxing the healthcare providers and the wealthier class Americans. Which is the reason as to why many wealthy Republicans and businessmen are so against Obamacare. Yet many people support it because of the common belief that healthcare should be a universal right for every human. But in the US, the average trip to the ER without medical insurance costs up to $1,200. Or, for instance, the cost to mend a broken foot is $16,000, and the cost for cancer treatment rounds up to $30,000 or higher. With health insurance, all of these medical excursions are covered with the exception of the small copays made to the hospital. During the war on drugs in the 80s, Reagan would expand the benefits of
Article 25 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, written in 1948, states that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of him or herself and of his or her family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services. The UN document from 1948 still stands in UN policy today. However, the US over these past decades has not been faring too well under the international spectrum for their views on healthcare. Most of the world's developed nations have universal healthcare, and these are the top 10 countries based on GDP, with their correlation to healthcare. The US has none. This graph disproves the notion that a single-payer healthcare system would harm the US economy. In another 2014 study, out of 11 developed nations, the US healthcare system was found to be the most expensive and worst performing in terms of health access, efficiency, and equity. The US is arguably the farthest behind of the developed nations in the 21st century. Bipartisan reform is needed. While single-payer healthcare is usually associated with socialism and the Democratic Party, one prominent Fox News columnist, Charles Cromather, is that how you say it?
We'll
States that
guarantee you this. Within a few years, there won't even be an argument about whether or not government has an obligation to ensure that everybody gets health coverage.
there is no doubt that the U.S. has a serious problem with healthcare, or lack of a proper single-payer system, that is evident in so many other developed nations today. Therefore, we must act, either by joining organizations like Medicare for All or Justice Democrats, or writing to your local congressman and demanding the need for universal healthcare. Thank you. Article 25 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, written in 1948, states